Hello, welcome to this video on why study the Phenomenology of Spirit. So the Phenomenology of Spirit is Hegel's most famous work and is also regarded as a notoriously difficult read. But in this video I'd like to give you 5 reasons of why you should study the Phenomenology of Spirit and what might be the benefits to you. So let's get into it. The first reason is that the Phenomenology of Spirit teaches you philosophy. So not everything for Hegel counts as philosophy, and philosophical activity as such may appear simple and obvious, but it is in fact extremely difficult. So what I mean here, you may have come across philosophers asking these plain, banal, and strange questions that should have a very simple answer to them, or a straightforward answer, or they shouldn't even be questions that need to be raised. Nonetheless, philosophers do raise them and ponder about them quite a bit. And a lot of the difficulty here has to do with coming into the philosophical mindset and thinking like a philosopher. And what I think are one of the difficulties for philosophy is kind of twofold. First of all, it doesn't have a straightforward object, the same way engineers can point to machines that they build, or engines or bridges and so on and so forth. Usually most disciplines have a straightforward object that they can point to or they begin with, and they are the discipline of that thing, right? They are focusing on the principles and the laws governing this or that. This becomes something much more difficult for philosophy, because philosophy isn't interested in things in their particularity as they are for us straightforwardly, but what is the underlying principles and essences and how they map onto reality as a whole, or even what is reality as a whole. So that gives philosophy a tough time, but there's something that makes it perhaps even a little bit worse, and that is that philosophy is really a form of reflection, meaning that as reflection it is always a negative kind of practice, a negative activity. And so if Hegel is going to teach us philosophy, his tactic in the Phenomenology of Spirit is to show us how various non-philosophical assumptions, which may seem obviously solid to us about truth and reality and what and so on and so forth, turn out to undermine themselves. They undermine themselves logically, and why they do that is I will elaborate a little bit on in the next point. So the first point is that the Phenomenology of Spirit is about teaching you to think philosophically. And Hegel thinks that this is necessary also for philosophy itself, that the philosopher or philosophically minded need to be aware of how the path to philosophy is made, because philosophy needs to argue and demonstrate its own positions, right? It cannot just take itself for granted, then it stops being philosophy. So being self-critical is a really important cornerstone in Hegel's thinking. So he talks about in the introduction, if I recall correctly, that the consciousness, or ordinary consciousness, somebody who's not philosophically trained, need to have a ladder to the philosophical standpoint. Well, that is what this text is all about. So the second point is that the Phenomenology of Spirit is a critique of worldviews. So what I mean here is that philosophy doesn't become pertinent in debating particularities or specific issues, but when certain particular or specific issues lay claim to universality, or stake a claim in terms of a overall worldview, or even present themselves as a certain worldview themselves. So just to take an example, there's lots of debates and discussions about gender and identity and so on and so forth, and one could think that it's just people are just obsessed about what is in their pants or something like that. But that's not really what's the issue. The issue is that these are all arguments for what it means to be human, and being human is a metaphysical value, and so it is all part of a certain worldview, and a worldview is something everybody has to share in. And so the contest or the difficulty, the discussions, they come in at this metaphysical point when everybody has to share into this the certain worldview that is presented by a certain group, and that another group is unable to find themselves at home in or rejects that, right? So the debate itself is a kind of figuring out and coming to the truth of these different particularities. But it's not the particularities themselves that is really making things pertinent. It's the metaphysical undertones, so to speak, that they are evoking, right? That is what gets people occupied in this and interested in this, as they should, because I think these are the metaphysical things that that occupy us the most. Questions of identity, as an example. So what the Phenomenology of Spirit does, more specifically here, is that it looks at certain more basic, at first, worldviews or claims to worldviews, and critiques them. But it critiques them imminently. It looks at them, looks at their criterions and standards that is latent in them, and see whether it is coherent with itself. So the first shape of consciousness, as Hegel technically calls them, is basically claims that what is true is what is immediately sensuous, right? Well, is that correct? Is that coherent, ultimately? Is everything true ultimately just something, whatever is immediately sensuous? So, off the top of your head, you might think, well, what about, laws of gravity or perception, which looks at a multi-property, multi-determinate object, right? That's not just immediate. There's something mediated there, right? So you can think of the ways in which this claim might be false. But what's important for Hegel is that this claim falsifies itself through using what logic is immanent in it. And that is also what adds the difficulty to this text, because you have to restrain yourself in not importing a bunch of other different things, because then you lose sight of the thing you're trying to critique. So another way of putting this is that we bring with us certain standards or criterions whenever we are thinking about what is true or how we figure out what is true, right? And this could be epistemology, the philosophy of knowledge, critiques, ethics, ethical values, or even metaphysics, right? There's lots of different sort of metaphysical systems out there. And Hegel in this book is trying to work not from a straightforwardly philosophical or even a philosophical standpoint, because such a standpoint is itself not justified, right? So he's trying to teach us philosophy. He cannot teach us philosophy if philosophy is already assumed, is already, there, because then philosophy is not justified. It just becomes something taken for granted. And Hegel thinks to be fully self-critical, we cannot take it for granted. The third reason is tarry along with consciousness and self-consciousness. So, as I may have mentioned already, Hegel calls these various claims to worldviews or presentations of worldviews as shapes of consciousness, right? And that within that term is consciousness. So what is consciousness? This is like a hugely fascinating and mysterious question that not only philosophers struggle to understand and come to terms with, but also psychologists, neurologists. There is various brain studies going on, and probably even mathematicians and physicists also kind of have their own ideas and thoughts about this. And because if you're thinking as a physicist about the totality of the universe, well, how do you fit consciousness into that totality? So the core thing that Hegel discusses in this text is consciousness and self-consciousness. And I won't sort of give you a straightforward definition here, because the whole point, I think, of the book is not to give you a straightforward definition. But I just wanted to highlight here how the whole book is about how consciousness learns about itself and comes to terms with itself through its various assumptions about itself and the world that it faces. So philosophically, for Hegel, I think he would say that, well, consciousness is whatever is faced with a sort of opposition between a subject and object. Simple as that. And he thinks that we can begin here because if you're conscious of something. You can be conscious of something outside of yourself, or you can think of yourself as an object to yourself, but there is still this kind of division or difference between the subject and object wherever you turn that gaze, so to speak. And what Hegel really is interested in then is looking closer at this difference and seeing whether it difference holds ultimately, or whether there is maybe something more at work in this difference. So, tarry along with consciousness. It is Hegel likens it to the stations of the cross in the book, right? It's a difficult journey, but one where illumination and insight will come to you through the work you put in. The fourth reason I'd like to give is that the phenomenology is an enduring legacy. One could even say an eternal legacy. It's a work that has influenced the greatest philosophers after Hegel and still continues to inspire people today. So I can just go off the quick list here. Karl Marx, Søren Kierkegaard, Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Frantz Fanon, Herbert Marcuse, Richard Rorty, down to leading intellectuals of the present day: Judith Butler, John McDowell, Robert Brandom, Marcus Gabriel, Sebastian Rödl, Charles Taylor, Slavoj Žižek, and many, many others. So it's a work that continues to be important. So you are in good company then when you are working on the Phenomenology of Spirit, because know that many other very smart people, very intelligent people have worked on this text and also struggled with it, right? And that there is still lots, I think, that one can draw out of the text and contribute back to philosophy. So the last thing I would like to say is something a little bit more difficult, a little bit more philosophical, and that has to do with what I call pure release. So the whole book is teaching you about philosophy, but what happens when you get to philosophy? Well, there Hegel talks about how philosophy has to sort of lose itself again. And this has to do with the nature of knowledge itself. So that knowledge not only knows the negative of itself, its limit, but gives this up too. So the sacrifice of philosophy for a new world, for the future's recollection. So I would just like to read a little bit from the text here. So this is paragraph 807 towards the very end. So here he speaks about, or actually let's go back a little bit. So in paragraph 806, Hegel talks about science, which is what he equates with philosophical thinking, in the sense of like, you know what it is you're doing, and there isn't a fundamental difference between the thinking of the object and the object itself. So what you're thinking about is thought itself. So there is a kind of equation there between things, such that there isn't a fundamental difference. Now, this philosophical standpoint, Hegel writes, contains within itself this necessity to relinquish itself of the form of the pure concept and to make the transition from the concept into consciousness. For self-knowing spirit, just for that reason that it grasps its own concept, is an immediate equality with itself, which in its differences is the certainty of the immediate, or is sensuous consciousness, the beginning from which we started. This release of itself from the form of its own self is the highest freedom and the highest assurance of its knowing of itself. So it's really powerful how Hegel then, once we get to the philosophical standpoint, it's not that we just drop the ladder or drop the things we have gained insight in, the experiences that consciousness have had, that we have had in reading the book. We see how it all plays a role and continues to play a role and continues to be something of enduring motivation for philosophy itself. So Hegel continues, nonetheless, this relinquishing is still incomplete. It expresses the relation of self-certainty to the object, an object which, just by being in the relation, has not yet attained its full freedom. Knowing is acquainted not only with itself, but also with the negative of itself, its limit. Right? So you can think here about, yes, I am a finite human being, I can only experience the things around me, right? So we tend to think in this kind of closed-minded way. But Hegel thinks that this is ultimately false, because we're not just thinking. As thinking beings, we are not just constrained by our physical sensuous circumstances. We take part in what any other mind takes part in as mind, right? So I can read Hegel's thoughts by reading this text. I can read Aristotle's thoughts. I can read Blake's aesthetic thoughts through his poetry, or Shakespeare, and so on. Now, to know its limit means to know that it is to sacrifice itself. This sacrifice is the relinquishing in which spirit exhibits its coming to be spirit in the form of a free contingent event, and intuits outside of itself, its pure self as time, and likewise intuits its being as space. So, through the end of phenomenology, the whole thing has been a logical examination of consciousness. But the truth that we gain throughout going through this journey is that the necessity we have uncovered, the logical necessity, gives up that necessity in order to become a free contingent event. Because otherwise there wouldn't be a full referential loop or systematic connection between the beginning and the end. Because at the beginning, we seem to begin something that is arbitrary or just contingent, or just happens to be there immediately, right? We happen to be in space and time. Why? Well, we don't know. We think about it. Then we systematize about it. We think, examine it, and so forth. But ultimately, our examination has to not include, but maybe comport itself such that it can begin again from where it had initially begun. Maybe put it like that. So this is very difficult thought, and is a reason it comes at the very end of the book, because we have traversed through the whole development that has ensued. But I think it's important to just mention it here, to highlight it here, to know that for philosophy, it isn't just pure philosophy that matters. It is the concrete, the most real truth that ultimately matters. The one that is found in and around us, what we perceive, what we make laws about, what we desire, and what kind of social structures and societies and laws and norms and so on, and religions and worldviews that we build. So I'd like to just end with a poem by Emily Dickinson, which I think kind of captures this this struggle in a very beautiful way. The hallowing of pain. The hallowing of pain, like the hallowing of heaven, obtains at a corporeal cost. The summit is not given. To him who strives severe, at the middle of the hill. But he who has achieved the top, all is the price of all. Thanks very much for listening in. I hope this was helpful. And as a final thing, I'd just like to kind of give this visual representation of 3 videos I've made about why one should study philosophy, why one should study Hegel, and why one should study the Phenomenology of Spirit. And I think one can kind of make a quasi-systematic connection between these 3 videos and the 5 reasons each of them gives, going from the most immediate thing down to the most mediated or self-mediated, or most true matter. And I've chosen to portray it as a tree because we shouldn't think of any of these bits as purely independent, but as something that contributes to the growing and the form of the whole. So, as I began in the other video, the summons of wonder, and then another video, the opening of thought, and in this video, teaching you philosophy, all of those things are kind of intertwined in the immediacy of the matter, in the immediacy of wonder and philosophy and so on, and that they're all nested or contained within what it means to know ourselves, to have this encyclopedic freedom of going wherever mind has gone, and then releasing ourselves from the purity of this realm into the concrete, and continuing the examination and the journey on and on and on, infinitely, to our eternal delight. Thank you very much.